Hi, everybody. It's Mary, the OG Woo Woo therapist. And as always, everything that I'm going to talk about today does not take the place of therapy or counseling. And if there is anything in today's podcast that you find you may need to investigate further, please contact a licensed therapist near you. So, today I'm going to talk about something in response to a question I got from podcast one. And the question was, does aphantasia, which is the inability to voluntarily generate a visual mental image, does that interfere with autobiographical recall of information? And no, it does not. The facts are still in the mind, the emotions are still in the mind. And so when we're talking about autobiographical recall, especially with trauma, the individual is absolutely capable of remembering whatever it is that is in the brain for them to remember. What aphantasia is that when they are asked to bring a mental image to mind of it, they are incapable of doing that. So people with aphantasia do not they just don't see pictures in their mind. It exists on a spectrum from absolutely no imagery at all to very faint imagery. And it is not a disorder by itself. It is a neurocognitive variation. It is not a neurodivergence. It is a neurocognitive variation. So what aphantasia is not is it's not a lack of imagination. It's not a memory deficit because, like I said, the words and the feelings are still in there and able to be recalled. It is not dissociation or repression, and it's not a visual processing problem. The eyes and the vision are still normal. They're just not able to close their eyes and have a picture in their mind. And it is not necessarily trauma related. However, in my case, I learned about aphantasia from working with someone who did have a diagnosis of CPTSD. And we were doing an exercise that I used with them called the meeting space. And so I asked him to close his eyes and bring to mind a place that would be a good meeting space for all of his parts, regardless of how old they presented. And when he closed his eyes really tight and he got this look on his face that looked like he was in a little bit of pain. And in my family, when somebody gets that look on their face, we know they're thinking because that is our assumption. Oh, you look like you're in pain. You must be thinking. So that was not the case with this guy. He was just working really hard to try to bring a picture to mind, and he couldn't. So what I had to do was give him a piece of poster board, and then he drew on the poster board what he saw as a meeting place. And then he labeled everything in there. He drew a square for the table and then little X's around it for chairs, and then furnished the rest of the room and did all of the rest of the stuff that I asked him to do in building the meeting place. So once he externalized it, he was perfectly capable of doing what I was asking him to do. So one of the interesting things about aphantasia is that it's usually discovered in adulthood. So the common triggers are where we're asking people to do guided imagery or meditation. So when I ask them, especially with hypnosis, when I would ask them to close their eyes and then imagine that they are someplace, they're incapable of doing that just because their brain doesn't do pictures inside the mind, but can put them outside the mind. And then, like the therapy exercise that we did, where I was asking him to bring to mind a meeting place, he wasn't able to do that. And then discussions about mental pictures. So when I ask people sometimes when they're trying to explain something and they're having difficulty with the words, and I ask them, it's like, well, just bring to mind a mental picture of that and then describe the picture to me. And then they're not able to do that, bring a mental picture to mind. And so a lot of times, many will assume metaphorical language until it's contrasted with others' experiences. So I use a lot of metaphor and that kind of stuff, especially with hypnosis, where I will tell a story to someone who is in trance. and use the metaphor to talk about what it was that we're doing the hypnosis for. And people who are incapable of the mental images don't really deal with bringing some kind of picture to mind of the metaphor that I'm telling them, but they absolutely understand the words of what I'm telling them. So it is primarily visual imagery that is affected with this. Other imagery domains are auditory, where we have an inner voice, or we're able to, imagine what sounds sound like. Kinesthetic or movement, where we can imagine moving our arm or something like that. Tactile, olfactory or gustatory, where we can imagine the smell. So it's like when growing up, if you came home and mom or grandma was cooking something, my thing that always takes me back to my childhood is when I smell fried onions, because we used to have fried onions in our food a lot when I was growing up, and that's not a complaint. I absolutely love fried onions, and I love the smell of them because it takes me back to those pleasant memories. And it doesn't bring a picture to mind necessarily, but it reminds me of being a certain age and coming home and smelling the onions cooking and knowing that we were going to have something good to eat for dinner. So the other thing is that some individuals have global imagery absence, and they are not able to bring to mind these other types of imagery domains, like hearing or imagining a sound that they heard, or being able to smell onions and have some kind of connection with some kind of memory, because the imagery is just absent. The other thing is that a lot of times when I ask people to bring to mind a pleasant memory, sometimes they'll bring to mind a memory of coming home from school and their mom was baking cookies. Let's say that's the example. And when I ask them, so what does that smell like? They're not able to imagine the smell. And so they'll just tell me it smelled like baked cookies. And so, so sometimes the other imagery domains are affected as well. So when we talk about memory and cognition, when it comes to aphantasia, autobiographical memory may be more conceptual, factual, or narrative, and less sensory or scene-based. So when somebody is giving me a recount of something that happened, they will have the words for it, and it will be factual, and they'll tell it like a story, sometimes even in third person. But they do not have any kind of focus on the scene. So if I ask them when they're telling me about something that happened, I can ask them, what room were you in? Then they can tell me what room they were in. And if I ask them what was in the room, then they can tell me what was in the room. But that's not part of the factual recall of the actual incidents, because that is part of the scenery of the incident and less important than the actual facts or the narrative. And a lot of times, future thinking often relies on planning, logic, and verbal rehearsal. And dream imagery can be present or absent, and it depends on the individual. So what that means is that people sometimes can recall their dreams and be able to describe what was happening in the dream, but they don't get an image of it in their mind, but they can describe the image. The other thing is that emotions are fully present with aphantasia when they talk about the autobiographical information. Emotional recall may be less vivid, but it's not any less meaningful. Some report that the imagery is less intrusive and that they have lower rates of visual flashbacks when it is related to trauma. Others experience emotion through somatic or cognitive pathways. So they might have recall instead of having the visual image of it, they can feel it in their body. So aphantasia versus poor visualization. With that, there's faint or unstable imagery And with aphantasia, there's no voluntary visual imagery. Aphantasia versus dissociation. Dissociation involves altered consciousness or memory integration. Aphantasia is stable, trait-like, and present across all contexts. Aphantasia versus alexithymia. Alexithymia is difficulty identifying emotions. Aphantasia is difficulty generating an image where the emotional awareness is intact. So some of the implications for therapy is that visualization basic techniques are ineffective and frustrating for the client. The common impacted modalities are guided imagery, EMDR visualization, hypnosis imagery scripts, and inner child imagery exercises. So when I ask people to close their eyes and see that inner child part of them, they're incapable of visualizing the inner child. However, they may be able to feel the presence of the inner child in their body. And the other thing is that clients may feel confused, defective, or excluded unless we actually talk about their inability to have a visual image. A lot of times, like with this guy that I talked about originally, he thought something was wrong with him, that maybe he sustained some kind of injury to his head that prevented him from being able to have a visual image of what we were talking about. And so when we talked about aphantasia, then he was able to understand that it was just, something his brain can't do. And then he was fine with it. So therapy adaptations that work well for someone with aphantasia is the use of somatic, emotional, cognitive, or symbolic approaches. So I replace the word see with notice, sense, know, or describe. And then external aids are written descriptions, objects, drawing or diagrams, and metaphors without visual demand. So we can talk about a story. So one of the things that I talk about when, maybe when I'm working with somebody who wants to eliminate a bad habit, a lot of times I'll use the story of the fox and the grapes, that he really wanted those grapes, and then when he finally got them, he found out they were sour. And so I will use that story a lot of times to bring down the desire for the use of the drug or the substance or the behavior, whatever it is the dependence is about. And they're able to understand the story and be able to know what I'm talking about without having to actually visualize it. And then the focus with people with aphantasia is on the meaning, the felt sense, narrative memory, and body-based awareness. So strengths that are commonly reported by people with aphantasia is that they have strong analytical thinking and they have good factual recall. They are highly verbal and have good logical reasoning. Reduced susceptibility to intrusive imagery. So that has a lot to do, especially with the people I work with, that they are less prone to visual flashbacks. And then they have effective problem-solving strategies. So one of the things that we talk about is client-facing normalization language. So language that I can use to make this normalized or less feeling less excluded because their brain is unable to visualize. So one of the things that I talked about with my client is that we just talked about how his brain processes imagery differently. Not that his brain is broken, it just processes it differently and it stores it as words. And I also reassure them that they can do deep emotional work without pictures. And many therapies can be adapted to how your mind works. So with EMDR, when they can't bring to mind a mental image, then I ask them to just remember the event. So it occurs to them in the narrative form. And then we can talk about how disturbing it is to remember that event or to remember a time when they felt like this or when that thing happened, and they're able to do that. So it is quite effective to do EMDR with folks who do not get visual images. And I have a client today that when I ask her to bring to mind an image, then she brings out her notebook and she writes it down. And in that way, she's got the memory of the image there. So one of the things that as a therapist I need to know is when to screen or clarify that maybe aphantasia is something that's going on with my client. And that is when they have repeated difficulty with imagery tasks. So I don't usually go to a second time. If they tell me they just can't get an image, then I just assume that we're talking about aphantasia, and then I just go to one of the alternatives that they can use. Or if they seem confused or disengaged during visualization exercises. So one of the things that I had to get to a place of knowing when my clients have that pained look on their face, that it's because they're usually incapable of bringing an image to mind. So I can stop and ask them, are you having difficulty with bringing the image to mind? And usually, always, they say yes. And then when I hear client statements like, I don't see anything, or I don't know what you mean by picture it. So one of the things I can use is a brief screening questions about what happens when I ask you to bring to mind an image of, a beautiful lake with the sun glinting on the water. And they will look at me and go, I've seen a beautiful lake with water glinting with sun glinting on the water, but I can't bring a picture of that to mind, but I know I've seen it. And then that tells me that we're looking at aphantasia. So the key takeaways from this discussion on aphantasia is that it is a normal neurocognitive variation, and it affects how people imagine, not whether they can heal. And therapy is most effective when methods match cognitive style. So clarity reduces shame and increases engagement. So when I understand that somebody may have aphantasia and are not able to do that, then I have alternative ways of working with them that are just as effective and can bring the same kind of healing. So the next thing I'd like to talk about today is to do a brief overview of internal family systems, or IFS. So one of the things about IFS is that the core idea is that the mind is made up of multiple parts, not a single monolithic personality, if you will. So the parts are normal, adaptive, and meaningful. And with IFS, they assume everyone has a self, which is the core state of calm, clarity, compassion, and leadership. And symptoms are expressions of parts trying to protect the system or the self. So the role of the self is that it is not a part. Self qualities are the 8 C's. The 8 C's that are comprise the self are calm, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, clarity, and connectedness. So healing occurs when the parts relate to self rather than to each other. So therapy focuses on increasing self-leadership, not eliminating the parts. So the categories of the parts are exiles, and they carry the wounds, trauma, shame, fear, and grief of the experiences from the past, and they're often frozen in time, so they're stuck in that trauma moment. Typically, they are pushed out of the awareness by the self, and they activate something resembles past pain. Protectors are the other part. I'm sorry, please excuse my dog. She's in the living room barking at something, probably somebody walking by the window or a cat. She really likes to bark at the cats, even though the cats will sit outside the window and they just don't care. So the other parts are the protectors, and they're there to protect the system from feeling the pain of the exiled parts. And then the managers, and they're proactive, controlling, preventative in their work. And some of the examples would be perfectionism, hypervigilance, people-pleasing, and intellectualizing. And then we have the firefighters. They are reactive, and they are urgent and crisis-driven. Excuse me. So some examples of that would be dissociation, binging, substance use, self-harm, and shutdown. So, how the symptoms are understood in IFS is that the symptoms are protective strategies, not dysfunctions. Extreme behaviors arise when parts are overburdened, afraid of exile activation, or lacking trust in self leadership. So, removing symptoms without understanding parts can increase the distress in the system. So, the therapeutic stance that we take when working with internal family systems is that it is non pathologizing. So, we don't make it a disorder. It's curious, respectful, and collaborative, and there's no such thing as a bad part. The therapist relates to the client's self, not their parts. And parts are approached with permission, never forced. So the healing process, what that looks like is that if I want to work with a part, then I work with that part through the self. So I ask the self to ask the part that uses alcohol to come forward and speak to me through them, and then the part will either agree to do that or not. So the healing process in ISF is to identify and differentiate the parts, unblend the parts from the self, build trust with the protectors, gain access to exiles safely, witness the exile stories, retrieve and unburden the exiles, and help protectors release extreme roles, or integrate new roles under self-leadership. So unburdening, we would consider burdens of the exiles, the beliefs, emotions, and sensations taken on during trauma. And it's not the part's identity, it's their experience. Often, these parts are burdened also with shame, fear, worthlessness, and the responsibility, feeling responsible for what happened to them. Unburdening uses symbolic imagery and somatic awareness. So symbolic imagery is what we just talked about with the aphantasia. So a lot of times we have to modify this. So do you sense? Do you notice? And then the somatic awareness of what's happening in their body. And then it usually results in a spontaneous shift in the protector. So when we're talking about IFS and trauma, trauma is held in exiles, and that is managed by protectors. IFS emphasizes safety before exposure. Protectors decide the pacing. And when we work with it, we avoid re-traumatization by preventing overwhelm in the exiles. It is particularly useful for developmental trauma, or the things that we experience as we're growing up, complex PTSD, CPTSD, which I talked about in a previous podcast, and attachment trauma, which we will talk about in a future podcast. So IFS and dissociation is the highest level of polarization or compartmentalization with IFS. So dissociation is often a firefighter strategy. And IFS can work gently with dissociation when there is sufficient self-energy and the parts trust the process. And it may need modifications or adjunct approaches for several structural dissociation, or for severe structural dissociation, which are the developmental dissociative things. So there is a lot of work that goes into building the trust with the parts to trust the process. First, they have to trust me as a therapist, and then they need to trust the process. So common misconceptions that I have to address with people is that IFS means I have multiple personalities, which it does not, that parts are imaginary, which they are not, and the goal is to get rid of the parts, which it is not, and that the self equals positive thinking, which it does not. Most clients often find IFS helpful because it reduces shame, it makes the internal experiences understandable, and it validates survival strategies. It also creates internal cooperation instead of internal conflict, which is really important in the healing process. and it empowers clients to become their own healers. So a sample of client-facing language, what I would use in talking to a client about their inner parts, would be instead of the client asking, what's wrong with me, we ask what happened and how did my system adapt. We don't try to eliminate parts. We help them feel safe enough to relax. When your system trusts yourself, symptoms often soften naturally. And sometimes the symptoms even will dissipate. So therapy adaptations, again, with some of the internal parts that we can use, have to do with the use of the word notice, sense, and those kinds of things, because it is not unusual for folks with IFS to also have aphantasia, where they cannot get an image of this part. And that's okay, because we can still do the healing with it. And IFS, the process of healing, there is training that is available for most therapists to do to work with internal family systems. Now, I have a very brief knowledge of it, just a little bit knowledge of it. It's not one of the things that I have been trained in or certified in to be able to do with my clients. However, we can talk about the internal parts as the firefighters, the exiles, and that kind of stuff as it relates to dissociation. One of the things that I do with my clients frequently is help them understand that dissociation is that amazing ability of the brain to protect itself in a very intense traumatic situation. So when we're talking about the different ways of identifying and working with people who have parts, IFS is the very basic strategy that we can use, and that is when there isn't anything that's on the upper continuum of that continuum of dissociation. So when we get to structural dissociation and DID, then we have to use other therapies with those, and I'll talk about those in a future podcast. So that does it for today. I hope you enjoyed this talk today. If it feels a little more disorganized than usual, it's because I just wanted to talk about what I know about these things rather than to present formal information where it sounds like I am an expert or that I am certified with IFS when I'm not. So it's just easier for me to talk about it, tell you what I know, and then we can go from there. So if you're interested in doing internal family systems work, find a therapist near you. And if you want to go to the Psychology Today Find a Therapist area, and at the top you can put in the things that you're looking for in a therapist. And one of the things you can do is identify a modality. And so you can identify that you're looking for somebody who does IFS. So with that, I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you all next week. If you enjoyed today's content, please give it a like. And if you are interested in hearing some more, subscribe so that you'll be notified when there's a new podcast. Thanks for listening.